Hello again. I'm Nick Leifker and welcome to Operations Management. I mentioned in the last video that we have this process, and from this process we generate value. And so hopefully our outputs, in other words, what we create from the process, is worth more than our inputs. In other words, we create value. So how do we do that? That's the question. How can we improve the process such that we generate more value? We make sure that what we generate, what we create, is of value. Well, we have a number of tools available to us that we can use. For instance, if we have a better idea as to what the future holds through forecasting, we can plan better. We can have a better idea as to what is going to happen and make good decisions as to what the future holds, as to what the future of our company, of our business needs to do. We can make changes to the process itself, reduce waste, improve the utilization of various parts within the process so that we're not wasting money. In some cases, we may need to launch large projects, and projects are, for the most part, processes writ large. In other words, very big processes that we do once. So the idea here is that we implement improvements, and how do we do that in an efficient and timely manner? And then we have quality. Now with quality, we have to make sure that what we do is done well, that our output, our product, is such that people are willing to buy it. This is one of the few parts of operations management that actually affects the value of the output, of what we actually give to the customer. In other words, we have to make sure that what we do is worth buying. After all, if it's not worth buying, what's its value? Now, inventory is a lot like that, and I need to explain what I mean by that. You see, you need inventory in order for your business to function. After all, inventory is what you use to create your product. So inventory is a good thing and it is a necessary thing, just as some body fat is an important and necessary thing to your life, to your human body. If you have no body fat, you have no energy. You keel over and die. However, what happens if your body has too much fat? Well, you become less agile, less able to adapt to your environment. In some cases, you may be so weighed down, so clogged by fat, that you could keel over and die. Well, in the same way, if what inventory is you're taking money and converting it to stuff. Now, money is about as liquid and acid as you can get. You can convert it into just about anything. Stuff is a little harder to convert back into money. So what can happen is a company can be so weighed down by stuff, on all of its capital tied up in stuff, in inventory, that it begins to weigh the company down, makes it less agile, less able to adapt to changes in the market, and in extreme cases, it can leave a company so bogged down that the company keels over, the company dies. So we have to have just the right amount of inventory for a company to function well, but not so much that our company is weighed down by it. Now, this last one, supply chain management. Companies figured out that they could get all of the other stuff done right. They could forecast for the future well, they could have their process well balanced, they could produce a high quality product, they could produce, they could have just the right amount of inventory to keep their company running properly. But they realized that if they don't manage their relationship with their suppliers and don't manage their relationship with their customers, none of it matters. Because ultimately what must happen is that this product, whatever you make, Eventually, it needs to get to the customer. So you have to make sure that you have the raw materials you need. So you need to manage your relationship with the supplier. And you need to make sure that your connection to the customer is also unhindered, is also not impeded, if you will. So, forecasting, process management, project management, quality, inventory management, supply chain management. These are the major topics that we are going to cover in this particular course. So, if this is how business gets done, with various forms of operations, with taking stuff and converting it into other stuff of greater value, taking inputs, converting them to outputs, then it doesn't matter what your discipline is within business. You need some idea as to how the business generates value, how the business makes money. So it doesn't matter if you're in accounting, marketing, HR, finance, you're going to make decisions that affect the business. So you need to understand how the business generates value. You need to understand how the business makes money. So if you're going to do your job well, you need to have some understanding as to, if you will, the laws of physics, the rules by which businesses run, the rules by which businesses operate. And that is where operations comes in. So, why are we here? We are here because if you are a business major, if you are going to go into business in some form or another, you're going to make decisions that affect that business. And if you're going to make good decisions, you need to understand how the business generates value. You need to understand how the business makes money. And that is where operations comes in. For example, accounting. Accounting, there's a concept known as going concern. In other words, is a company going to stay in business? Well, to understand that, you need to understand how that business works, how that business operates, how that business functions. So, you need to understand how money flows through a business, how product flows through a business, if you're going to audit that company properly. So, if you're not careful, if you're not paying attention to how the business makes money, you may end up blinding yourself to what the business is doing, and perhaps blinding yourself to fraud that this company may be performing. Finance. With finance, you invest. You take that money and you hopefully make it into something of greater value. Great quote from the late 1990s. Someone once asked Warren Buffett why he didn't invest in companies like Global Crossing, like WorldCom. His response was very simple. He didn't understand how they made money. As it turned out, that quote was remarkably prescient because he understood that, or more to the point, he couldn't understand how the company made money. And as it turned out, they weren't making money. So he didn't think it was a good investment. If you're going to invest in a company, if you're going to invest in a business, you need to understand how that business makes money. That's operations. Now, with human resources, well, one thing I've discovered is that people do not work by themselves. People are part of a larger whole when it comes to business. And as a result, we need to have some way of evaluating how people work within that whole, within that group, within that business. So if we're going to have an accurate understanding of how an employee fits within the larger framework of the business, if we want some idea as to how to accurately grade how an employee is working within the business, we need to have some idea as to how that business works. Then finally, marketing. With marketing, ultimately you have this relationship. That's the point of marketing, to manage the relationship with the customer. So, to that end, promises are made. Now, Can you keep those promises that you made to your customers? What happens if you can't? So you need some understanding as to how that company will keep its promises. So let's take a look at it from a slightly different angle. What happens when a business transaction occurs? What happens when a business transaction occurs? Well, what generally happens is this. Someone has money, and they give money to this company. So what does the company give in return? The company gives some form of product offering. That product may be a good, maybe a physical item, maybe a service. It might be a promise, more money in the future. Think about an investment, if you will. So there's this exchange of money from the customer to the business in exchange for some product offering, some good, some service, some promise, but a product offering of some type. So, what business discipline manages the money? Well, that's generally finance, with accounting to keep them honest. After all, finance is the group that does the investing, that takes care of the money and makes sure that it's handled properly. Well, what business discipline manages relationship with the customer? Well, that's marketing. Marketing is the one that handles that relationship. Well, what business discipline manages the stuff, manages the product offering? That is operations. So, what happens if any of these three fail? What happens if finance doesn't do its job? Well, without money, the company's going to go out of business. What happens if we don't manage the relationship with the customer? Well, if we don't manage the relationship with the customer goes away, they don't spend money, so we're out of money, and we go bankrupt. So, what business manages the stuff, manages the product offering? Well, that's operations. Well, what happens if we don't do our job there? Well, if we can't get the product to the customer in the way that they want, all of a sudden, the customer's going to go away. What happens if the customer goes away? The money goes away, and we find ourselves bankrupt. So, all of these parts of business are necessary. The management of all of these parts of business are necessary if we want to maintain a healthy company. So, we've basically been dancing around this issue of operations management. What is it? Well, from Stevenson, and by the way, Bill Stevenson is actually a fairly local professor. He works over at RIT, but he basically says operations management is the management of systems or processes that create goods and or provide services. So, we talked a little bit before about what processes are. You take stuff and you make it into more valuable stuff. So what's that stuff? What is the good or service? Well, before we can get to that, we need to have some understanding as to what these are. So, what's a good, what's a service? Well, some people would tell you that that's kind of obvious, that goods are tangible physical items. You can hold it in your hand, you can put it in inventory, you can feel it. Goods are something that you can keep. They're physical objects. Services, on the other hand, are acts. They're things that are done for other people. That said, it's important to note that the two are not as separate as you might think. Case in point. Suppose you buy anything. Well, what happens if something goes wrong with the product? Well, hopefully, if something goes wrong with the product, there may be a customer helpline that you can call. Well, guess what? That's a service. It's possible that there may be some sort of repair service that is available. Well, that's a service. Uh, it's possible that there may be warranties involved. So that's another service involved. So you may buy this physical good, but there are oftentimes services attached to it. In the same way, if you buy what you would normally consider a service, there's oftentimes goods attached to that as well. For instance, suppose you go on a flight on an airplane. A flight on an airplane is most definitely a service. After all, you don't get to keep the seat. However, hopefully in that service, they serve drinks, sodas of some type. Also, hopefully during that flight, there's hopefully food. So the food and drink, that's good. That's a physical item. That's something you can keep. In the same way, you go to a haircut place, hair salon, hairstylist, whatever you want to call, whatever type of hair design place you go to. Usually you end up leaving with less than what you had before. After all, the idea of going to a hair salon or hairstylist is to get it cut. So that would most definitely be a service. However, there are various things that are used in that service that you do get to keep, at least for a little while. After all, if you put in some type of hairspray or hair gel into your hairstyle, then that most certainly is a good that you get to keep, at least for a little while. So as we see with these product offerings, there's usually this combination of both goods and services. As a result, we can't easily separate the two. We can't just separate one from the other without being very careful as to what goes into our overall product. Now, this understanding of goods and services is complicated by history. Case in point. In 2009, almost 77% of the US GDP was generated by services. So think about that. Over 3/4 of the United States gross domestic product is generated by non-tangible acts. Well, that's nice and all, but there's something to understand. These numbers were not always like this. In fact, in the years immediately after World War II, these numbers were inverted. In other words, we were a primarily industrial goods economy. We were producing industrial, physical goods. So what happened? Well, change happened. Change oftentimes happens. And so what ended up happening is, as time progressed, we started moving away from a dependence on industrial physical goods and towards a greater dependence on services. For instance, around 1975 or so, we were roughly even. In other words, we had about an equal amount of goods and services for our GDP. This has had an interesting effect on what we know and what we understand with regard to operations. You see, most of the research done with regard to operations was done after World War II. After all, it was kind of needed during and after World War II, as we'll see. So the result is that most of our knowledge base with regard to managing operations deals with goods. So if most of our economy is services, isn't that kind of a problem? Well, yeah, because services have some interesting issues when it comes to managing them. For instance, when it comes to managing services, that tends to have a much higher customer interaction. So think about this. This is known instinctively. If you've ever worked fast food, or you've ever worked as a waiter or waitress, or if you've ever worked retail, sometimes you have the best customer ever. You know, just the sort of customer that makes your day, that makes everything worth doing. And then you may have the customer from heck. You may have a customer who, it doesn't matter what you do, they've had a bad day and they're going to take it out on you. So, if so much of the customer experience is dependent on the customer, is dependent on the mood, the temperament of the customer, well, how do you deal with that? You know, how do you measure whether or not you've done your job, whether you've not done your job well? It may be difficult, may even be impossible. Second, well, service jobs tend to be far less structured than manufacturing jobs. Two cases in point. Just look at everyone's hairstyle next time you go walking down the street. Everyone's hairstyle is different in one form or another. Different color, different base, well, first of all, different base hair. After all, everyone's hair is different in some form or another. And then there's how they decide to style their hair, how they decide to cut their hair. So there's this individualism that tends to be involved when it comes to managing services. Everyone wants their service done their way. So when you have this individual aspect to services, some services may be very easy. Some may be incredibly difficult. Another issue that tends to come up when it comes to services is that it's not just the customer who could have a bad day. It could be the employee who's having a bad day. Oh, suppose suppose I was really sick one day and I had to teach a class coughing up a storm. It would make for a very difficult experience. Not just for me, but for the class as well. So it's not just the customer that has this serious effect on the overall service. It can also be the worker as well. So all of this culminates in this final issue that it can be difficult to define what is quality when it comes to managing services. Now, quality in general is ultimately defined by the customer, but that can be somewhat nebulous when it comes to the customer themselves. You know, if it's a physical good, we can measure physical goods. We can measure how much weight, how much cereal is in a cereal box. We can measure the dimensions of a particular physical item. But the quality of a service, well, usually about the only thing you can do is you can ask, okay, did it meet your expectations or no? And as we mentioned before with the customer interaction aspect of it, that's a significantly subjective experience. So, all of these issues come into play when it comes to managing services. Okay, well, in the next video we're going to talk about the history of operations, how we went from just individual craftsmen working alone to an interconnected, interrelated world. And so that is coming up in the next video. Until then, be well and take care.